watch The Good Life regularly might remember Dr. Charles Thaxton I interviewed a few weeks ago. He's an author and a chemist, and we talked about his book, The Origins of Life, and he was one of the most interesting we've had in a long time, because I think this message and our subject matter today is so crucial even to the well-being of this nation. Because if you believe that you were made in the likeness and image of a holy, righteous, creative God, you're going to have a little different view of life than if you think you just kind of happened out of a pond somewhere. And so we're talking about creationism. And Professor Tom Woodward, of course, talks to us about this, and he brings these people. Well, Dr. Thaxton gave an address at Trinity College, and we're going to show you parts of that, but Tom is here with us right now, so nice to see you.
Thank you. Appreciate your invitation.
Well, always, and I know the viewers love you. They love people who are knowledgeable, at least on one subject. Most people never accomplish that. Why don't we sit down?
Okay.
And what we're going to do is show some video of an address that Dr. Thaxton gave.
Right.
And maybe you can prepare us for this, because that's a little bit different and maybe even far more informative than an interview.
Well, it was a unique, really, I've never attended an event at Trinity like this. We had a breakfast. It was a special breakfast in his honor. And what we did is we invited college students, high school students, you know, regular laymen, adults, men and women from the area. And our cafeteria was packed. I mean, you couldn't you could barely fit in another person in our cafeteria. It was an exciting moment. And Dr. Thaxton, who in my opinion is one of the leading thinkers in Christendom today, among all believing Christians, about this area of origins. Where do we come from? And how do you deal with, you know, these bombardments of evolutionary teaching that, you know, the schools and the universities and the press continually put at us? And he just shared an unusual, what I call, life story. And I've never heard a talk like this. And he basically traced his personal life story and his interaction with scientists, both in terms of the book that he wrote that I describe as the atomic bomb of this whole debate.
Yes, I think I misquoted. It's the mystery.
The mystery of life's origin.
Of life's origins.
You were very close.
Pretty close.
Yeah,
pretty close. I think that I'd like to commend you for bringing to this area the finest, and that more people would take advantage, because first place, you know who these people are. Most of us have never heard of them because we're not in those circles.
Well, Dr. Thaxton really is one of my mentors. I met him way back in 1986 at an office in Dallas, Texas, where he was just beginning to help put out his books to the leading, literally the leading scholars, chemists, biologists, thinkers in this area in the whole world. And his book was so carefully written. It was 4 years in the writing, and it was thousands of hours of research, and every detail was meticulously backed up with you know, all the necessary research. And when I met him, I was struck with the sparkle in his eye.
Yes.
And the warmth. I mean, this was a real person. This wasn't some, you know, white lab coat chemist.
Right, that was
you couldn't
my
even
impression.
understand what he was. A real person. A little bit like Francis Schaeffer, maybe. You know, Francis Schaeffer was a philosopher and an apologist, a defender of the faith, but he was a kind of a little, I don't want to use the word Santa Claus in the sense of, you know, a spry, jovial person without substance.
Accessible,
but
though.
Accessible, yes. I'd say the most significant thing that Dr. Thaxton shared was just his own life story. And so that's what we're looking forward to sharing.
Well, as you mentioned, the research he did and taking 4 years to write it, I would think that within itself demanded some real respect from this community.
Well, it did, and he had actually himself amassed a library of all the material that's been written on the subject of how, you know, life supposedly grew out of a soup. You mentioned the muck or the slime, the pond. And this is still the predominant theory, is that life began in a warm little pond somewhere, and some chemicals just held hands, and life began that way. But I thought I'd just mention, before we rolled the tape, of the conference that took place. I mentioned to you, I think, Christianity Confronts the University. It was this conference where the leading scholars in the world were brought together at a campus in Dallas, Texas. And in 1985 or 86, this conference took place, and Dr. Thaxton was the moderator of the Science Day. They had one day where just the scientists like 6 or 8 atheists on one side and 6 or 8 Christians on the other, and they debated in a friendly spirit. And Dr. Thaxton's book and the other 2 authors, Walter Bradley, who teaches at A&M, Texas A&M, and Olson, were sitting there on the Christian side, and the book had just been published. Well, Clifford Matthews, bless his heart, Clifford Matthews, an atheist researcher in this area, was giving this talk on how we came from stardust. You know, we're evolved matter. And in the middle of his talk, he puts in a slide a picture of the mystery of life's origin and makes a startling, praising comment of this book. And all of a sudden, the atheist who invited Clifford Matthews to come for the atheist side say, wait a minute, do you realize that those guys are on the other side of the auditorium right over there? He said, so what?
Yeah.
He says it's a great book. I think we have the quote. When he made that quote, Dr. Thaxton said, you know, he says, I believe that this comprehensive and penetrating critique is essential reading for all students of the origin of life. They will be stimulated by clear and fair arguments to make up their own minds as to whether or not there is a crack in all current theories of origin. Clifford Matthews, professor of chemistry at University of Illinois at Chicago. Now, the interesting thing is that Clifford Matthews himself is an atheist. And what he says is this is a unique book. It's a book that's so powerful on the other side that I require my graduate students to read it. And then the next day,
interesting.
It is, and then the story gets better. The next day, a professor of philosophy from Great Britain, from England, came in. His name is Anthony Flew. And Flew is, I think, retired now, but he is regarded as one of the great atheist philosophers of our time. Well, that night, he was so curious, he took a copy of Thaxton's book. There was a bunch sitting on the table. He took it to his hotel room, read it that night, most of it, came down breakfast the next morning. He said, Dr. Thaxton, this is a unique book. I've never read a book like this. He said, it is completely different from anything I expected from a creationist vantage point. And he said, you know, I really respect you for what you've done. And Dr. Thaxton said, would you put that in writing? And he did. He wrote him a letter. I think we have that quote, too.
All right. This is from
Anthony Flew, the philosopher.
Great Britain.
Right. Specifically, he wrote in his letter to Dr. Thaxton, it was entirely right and proper that Charles Thaxton, Walter Bradley, and Roger Olson were able to publish their book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, and did publish it with normal, mainstream, scientific, and philosophical publisher rather than some specialist biblical house, for their very strong, notice this, their very strong and very effective criticism is an essential part of and contribution to straight science. Anthony Flew.
That is an endorsement, I
mean, in the #1 in Great Britain, the #1 atheist philosopher says, listen, this is a book that we all should read on our side of the fence. I mean, I've never heard...
I'll have to commend them for that.
Yeah, the little bit of open-mindedness that is really expressed in those comments. And then third, I think we have one more quote we'll talk about in a minute. But the gentleman that gave the third quote, Harold Morowitz, a professor at Yale, the critical aspects of this book are indeed commendable. The mystery of life's origin is thus an interesting start with considerable scientific thrust, said Harold Morowitz, professor of biophysics, Yale University. And anybody who's worked in this area of the origin of life understands that Morowitz is the one that really wrote the textbook on the physics, on the physical aspects of the origin of life.
Like a household name within that
community. And so the thing that I'm trying to get across to Christians is that the Lord has raised up in our time very sharp scholars, people who have a sharp mind but who have devoted it to the service of the Lord, of their Creator, and are using their research to share the good news of what He has done.
You mentioned there were high school students there. I think it's very, very exciting that...
we had almost, I'd say, about a dozen or 2 dozen high school students that were there at that time.
We're going to take a look at that address.
Okay.
When was this given?
This was given in November, just the week before Thanksgiving.
So here it is, Dr. Charles Thaxton, and then Tom and I will be back after we hear part of his address.
It is certainly a pleasure to be here. I have heard many good things about Trinity College, not only from Tom, but others as I have traveled around. And I really count it as a privilege to be here with you today. I would like to take a few minutes with you today and tell you a story about how this book came to be. But in order to understand this story, you have to go back to when I was in high school. It's amazing how many people, I mean, I don't consider myself an intellectual. People call me that. I mean, I've heard those kind of things. But when I was in high school, I really struggled. In fact, I made many D's on many different courses through high school. And one year I went back to see my high school transcript, and I stopped counting after a couple of dozen. And many times I look back and I wonder, how in the world did I ever get into something like chemistry? And I like to tell you something, because we don't always understand our own motives at the time we have them. But there was one experience I look back on. I'm not particularly proud of it, but it was a big motivation at the time. I was a high school student, and I was mostly interested in baseball and running track and that sort of thing, and sports was my life. I was not interested in the academic subjects. I was taking a chemistry course, and I dogged that. And then I had a physics course later, and I didn't do very well in that either. But about halfway through that physics course, the teacher was handing out pieces of paper to nearly everyone in our class. We were a class that many of the students going to college had to take in order to finish their preparation. And I asked my teacher, well, why he did not give me a piece of paper? And because I didn't like to be left out. I was in that class because most of my friends were in there. I didn't have any other reason to be taking physics, I'll tell you that. And so I was taking the, he said, looked at me and he said, well, this is only for people who are going to college. Immediately, having never thought about it before, well, I'm going to college. And his response was, you haven't got the brains to go to college. And that hurt. That really hurt. So I had been a Christian for a couple of years at that point, and I went back home that very day. I think for the first time in my life, I had a serious prayer before God. I got down on my knees beside my bed, and I said, Father in heaven, am I really that stupid? If you'll give me the brains to go to college, I will serve you with my life. That was a very simple prayer. You know, you probably have many people who've had prayers like that. But in a way, it's no more than like foxhole faith. Because I was only put in that position out of being humiliated before my friends. Okay, but I dedicated myself to study. And I had to study because I really didn't know much at that point. So I went to a junior college to start. Didn't have the grades to be able to go anywhere else. And fortunately at that time, I could even get in a junior college. And so I started this junior college, and I studied. And after about 2 years, I had actually found myself with a big picture of me in the yearbook for having received the chemistry award. I had studied, and I found that I could do chemistry. I liked it, excuse me, and I kept pursuing it. Then I went to Texas Tech to study more chemistry. And then after I finished at Texas Tech, I tried to get a job. Like I say, not the best motives, but I couldn't get a job. I was talking to this young lady over here. She said that you have to have a master's. Well, that's precisely what happened to me. I interviewed for a position. They said, well, I'm sorry, but you need more education. We can't take you until you have a master's degree. Well, having never thought about getting a master's degree until then, I went on back and I got my master's degree in chemistry. So then I interviewed for a job again. And I went out with a few job interviews, and each one told me the same thing. I'm sorry, but you just don't have enough education for what we're doing. You need to have a PhD. So never having thought about getting a PhD, I went to Iowa State, and I did my PhD in chemistry. Now, somewhere about the time, the late 60s, I was about to get my, to go in for interviews for my, for jobs. And the job crunch hit. A lot of people were being laid off in these science and technology positions. And I can even remember one gentleman from one national laboratory came to our university, gathered all of the upper-level science students, and recommended that all physics students, theoretical physics students, change their major because there were no jobs, and many did. And so I was still going to go through the interview process, and guess what? Well, I'm sorry, but the job market being like it is, you're overqualified. So what do you do when you're overqualified? So I thought, well, what do I do? What do I do? Well, anyway, there's something else that was going along besides just this kind of progression in my life. About halfway through my PhD program, I had a very interesting development, personal one. I mentioned to you that I had become a Christian when I was younger, but it was one of those things that didn't really take in my life. Intellectually, I was thrown through a maelstrom of confusion during college. Nearly everything I took, it seemed to challenge and pull the rug out from under my faith as a Christian, every step of the way. I had a number of professors, one of whom I can recall very vividly, when we walked into the classroom the very first day we were there, he said, "How many of you are Christians in this class?" Well, I was not volunteering for anything, and so there were 2 or 3 who raised their hands, and I was a chicken. And so they said, the professor said, "Well, we'll see whether you are at the end." And so I was sitting there, and I'm sure there were many others like me at the same time who were kind of quivering and shaking and wondering, well, what was going to come down next. And by the end of that year, he was right. These 2 that he had identified no longer were calling themselves Christians. And I was wondering about it myself. So toward the end of all that, something else had happened. I had a roommate who had no Christian experience or background at all. And this roommate, I didn't know it, but he had become a Christian also. And after a period of time, I let him know that I was a Christian. He let me know he was a Christian. And we began to pray together. We attended a Bible study together in the mornings. We also did a lot of studying together. We organized a few groups, and I started to teach a Bible study myself. This was about another 2 years later after that. But along that whole way, my life began to come back together again as a Christian. Not because of all the great studying and things and having met people like Tom over here who could answer my questions, but because of the power of a transformed life. My roommate was a Christian who, I would say, God's power had changed him in a very dramatic way from the way I had known it earlier. And I could not discount the fact that something had happened, and I wanted to know what it was. So it was on that basis that I began to attend the studies he was going to, and gradually got involved in myself in teaching classes. Eventually I had a group of graduate students and professors who were taking a Bible course that I was teaching at our campus at Iowa State. And also during that time, I read a remarkable paper that came and appeared in a chemistry journal. And the title of it was Life Transcending Chemistry and Physics. It was the title story in the Chemical Engineering News magazine, August 1967. So that tells you about the time period when this was happening in my life. And I read that article, and it was just electric, the impact on me. He was saying that there is something about this genetic molecule DNA that is unlike any other molecule we know. It does not fit the pattern of being structured by chemical and physical laws. In fact, if it were like chemical, physical processes or laws that did it, it would have the structure of a crystal and would not convey or carry information like we see in a book, message sequences in a book. Well, he did not spell it all out. A lot of this I kind of inferred from his article, from myself. But I thought it was such an extraordinary idea. If this molecule does not have the result of chemical and physical laws, well, then where did it come from? And that was in 1967. And it was by the end of my PhD studies that I finally felt like, well, I am supposedly educated. I can apply what I know to my own course of interest in my own studies. After all, I said I was so overqualified I couldn't get a job now. So what was I going to do with my time? So I did like all people did. I went and did a postdoctoral study. You know, more education is what you need to cure the problem of being overqualified. So I went to Harvard to study the history and philosophy of science. And while I was there, I did a lot of research in the libraries and studies, and read more than 400 books during that 2 years I was there. I was just a reader all the time. Really not only making up for all the years I didn't study and read anything. In fact, I was telling somebody not long ago that the very first book I can recall ever reading was a little children's book called The Pink Flamingo, and I read that in junior high school. That was the first book I ever read. In fact, I used to, I'm sorry to hate, I see we have some high schoolers, it looks like, or early students. I hate to tell you this, but in many of my English courses, I got through by reading the classic comics. You know, the classic comics, to read those stories. I couldn't read those big, thick novels. Boy, though, I couldn't do that. I just didn't have what it took to stay with those kind of long novels. In fact, to this day, I can't read a long Russian novel. You ever been able to do that? My wife thrills with them, but I cannot, my train of thought kind of diverges. And all those complicated names, I had to move to Czechoslovakia before I could get used to such big names. Okay. Now, after I was being influenced by this article by Michael Polanyi, a very famous Hungarian scientist, and with this article about life-transcending chemistry and physics. And then I was trying to finish up my own thesis. And then I ran across a book in our bookstore, and the title of it was Biochemical Predestination. The author was a man by the name of Dean Kenyon, who was a professor at San Francisco State. And I read that book. As a chemist, I thought, well, now I have the tools. A lot of the biological things, evolutionary subjects, I really didn't feel at that time qualified to understand, let alone give a critique of. But this chemical evolution, maybe I could understand this and really give an evaluation of it. I was absolutely gripped to the base of my soul when I read that book, because it did seem that there is indeed a credible case that living things on this planet are the result of nothing other than natural chemical processes. And so I read that book, and I was really, there was a certain point in that book where I thought, you know, maybe those professors were right, that I won't be a Christian at the end of this course. And I can remember having a prayer at that point, and I said, Lord, if you really are there, and there were times when I had doubts at that point. Lord, if you really are there, and there is a way to understand what is happening, even with a subject like this. Here I have my PhD now. I should be able to understand this. If there is a way to evaluate it, to understand where the tricks are, if there are any tricks, and how to give an evaluation that is proper and legitimate. Because I didn't want to be on the outside like throwing rocks at a house you build. I want to be within and understand. If you can do this for me, then I would like it very much. And, you know, as I read that book again, there was one sentence in Kenyon's book that struck me very vividly. It said to the effect that the way we must approach the study of chemical evolution is to make the assumption that there was no supernatural influence at any point along the way. And it was just like a light turned on for me when I read that, and I thought about it a while. Well, if that is true, that there's no supernatural influence at any stage in the development of life, and if we're in the laboratory going to be simulating conditions and processes that we say appeared and occurred on this planet 3 to 4 billions of years ago, then the proper approach in doing these experiments is to do what you can do to eliminate the effective role of the investigator. So then at that point, I had a way. And I started reading books about how these experiments were done. I traveled in different universities where there were experiments being done, talked with the researchers. How do you do these experiments? I wanted to know how these were done. And I began to read the fine print, you know, the small part in these research journals that told exactly how the experiments were done, what they did to make their chemical apparatus, and with things that didn't work as well as things that did. I wanted to know everything I could learn about it. The end result of all that was one of the chapters in this book which gives an analysis of the role of the investigator in these experiments. The end result of all that was I determined that the investigator is taking credit for what he is saying nature did. Now that is really not fair if you're trying to say that you are in your experiments mimicking natural processes that occurred in the remote past. So that was a key insight, I think, that led to the development of this book. But I want to quickly shift gears, if I can, for a moment to something else, because it has to do with the psychological barrier before this book could be put together. As I mentioned, the kinds of intimidation that I had received in university about my faith as a Christian, not so much directed at me, but as directed at anyone who had such beliefs. And here I was beginning to entertain thoughts that maybe this chemical evolutionary idea is not what it is cracked up to be. The space program that developed in the late 60s and was leading toward the Viking project to go to Mars in 1976, land a spacecraft on Mars, and be able to search for living things there. This was all during my graduate school days, and I was studying chemistry and applying it to these subjects, my own background in chemistry, applying to these questions. And along the way, I was giving also lectures. I traveled to many university campuses and gave lectures about the analysis that I had come to about these experiments, chemical evolution experiments. And one of the experiences that I had was I would like to share with you. It was at Auburn University. And this is what I call my Swiss cheese experience. And you'll have to bear with me as I explain this, because I think it'll give you an insight into what led to this book. I forgot the year. It was 60. It must have been 75 or 76, 77, somewhere in that time period. I was at Auburn University, gave a lecture, and had given it the same lecture, analysis of chemical evolution, a number of times during the day. Some of the graduate professors had heard about my lecture and wanted to attend, so they asked if I would give one more lecture at the end of the day. Many of the professors attended with the graduate students, and I went through the lecture one more time. As I started, after a few minutes, the one professor had an objection. Now, to understand the objection, I'll have to give this, like I said, the Swiss cheese analysis. This is my story of the Swiss cheese theory of knowledge. So you can take a pen down and write this down. Swiss cheese theory of knowledge. You may never know when you need this. If you were to imagine knowledge as like a huge plane of cheese, in this case, Swiss cheese. I'm talking about particularly the field of chemical evolution now. If you were an expert at mouse, and you stick your head up over here in one little area called chemistry, and then you see, because you're now expert in the field of chemical evolution in the area dealing with chemistry, then you are aware of the holes in your area. You understand what I'm getting at? But if you look at across the plane of this Swiss cheese, other disciplines remote to you, it all looks solid over there from your perspective. In fact, you would have to have an aerial photograph to look down and see all the holes, you see. But from where you are, it looks solid out there in the distance. Now, this is what I found in this interdisciplinary presentation I did that day at Auburn. Because after a few minutes, one professor said, he was in perhaps chemistry. I can't recall the order in which these occurred. But the chemist spoke up and said, "You know, geology professor over there, I remember reading a story once about this, and I can't believe you're going to allow this critic to go on without speaking up." And so the geologist spoke up and said, "Well, no, he's right about that information. It's new information." "So, okay," said the chemist. So a few minutes more, well, the geologist was all outraged now. He said, "I can't believe, Mr. Chemist over there, that you're going to allow this man to say these things without giving objection." The chemist said, "Well, no, that's right. That's new discoveries that we didn't know back in those days when you had that course." And see, this is the problem. Each discipline was objecting to something. I would say, it took me an hour to go through a 30-minute presentation because of all of the objections along the way by different people in different fields. And after a while, it occurred to me, you know what? This subject is really excellent if you have the up-to-date material from all these different disciplines and you apply it to this question. You can understand that there is a valid criticism that no one apparently understands. Because each one and each discipline, see, we're so fragmented